Yate, abine, or good afternoon, actually, and welcome to Sihasin Hour. My name is Mahayo Manus, and I'm the Public Relations Director for Yeha Altnido, who does business as the Navajo and Hopi Families COVID-19 Relief Fund. And today we're going to talk about climate change, and we're also going to talk about the impacts of climate change on our natural resources, our cultural resources, and what these impacts mean to us as tribal people. How are we able to mitigate or fight against some of these impacts that seem to be pushing and affecting our environment as we move into the future here. And we do have an esteemed guest today with us, Professor Rebecca Tsosie. And Professor Tsosie is a Regent Professor at the James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona. I'm going to go ahead and let Professor Tsosie introduce herself. So if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Thank you, Mahayo. It's such an honor to be here today. So my professional title is Regents Professor of Law, and I'm a Morris K. Udall Professor of Law also. And I do a lot of work on public policy in addition to federal Indian law and international Indigenous human rights. I'm Yaqui on my dad's side, and I've been living in Arizona for a long time. So I've seen many changes in terms of the approach of the state of Arizona with respect to the tribal nations of this land and the land and waters that they exercise sovereign authority over. So that is my field. I was at Arizona State University prior to coming to the University of Arizona, and I was the executive director of the Indian Legal Program there, and have had the honor for over 25 years of working with many Native students, both from Arizona, from other states, as well as internationally. So thank you.
Oh, great. That's great. And we're really, like I said, we're very honored to have you here. We have an hour that we're going to discuss some issues revolving around climate change. So we're just going to kind of jump right into it. I think as tribal people, we all understand that we're kind of the first to feel the impacts of climate change. I think if we look at the histories of our governments and how they've been implemented within our nations, we can see that many of these governments, the governments were set up to foster resource extraction or to foster certain aspects of going after our resources on tribal lands. If we look at the Navajo Nation, we've had a long legacy of coal mining that's happened here within the Navajo Nation, and this type of resource extraction has produced so much greenhouse gases, or a lot of greenhouse gases. And as we know, greenhouse gases absorb infrared radiation, they trap heat within the atmosphere, and the presence of these greenhouse gases contribute to a warming planet. And so this type of extraction and processing of natural resources, they say, makes up half of the global greenhouse gas emissions, while contributing to more than 90% of global diversity loss and water stress impacts. So as tribal people, we think, well, how does that affect us? We look at our lives, in our lands, in our environments, as being connected. Everything's connected. We're connected to the earth. We're connected to the plants, the animals, the atmosphere. And we start to notice that there's changes, and these changes are impacts of climate change. We can see that much of our water supply is starting to diminish. We can see that we're having global impacts. This year alone on the Navajo Nation, we've had quite a bit of flooding. Now, that could just be a wet year, but it could also be an impact of how our climates are changing. So you can kind of just setting it up in that way, as we look at things like environmental justice. Environmental justice for Native people goes hand in hand with Indigenous rights, sustainability. And often we experience that our lands are the first to be targeted for things like resource development. And we can see that there's environmental injustice that happens on tribal lands. So, along those lines, this is maybe I'm jumping all over the place here, but, how is it that you might be able to elaborate or to maybe let us know, how are tribes able to redefine the perspectives that they have to fight against climate change and to take stands against certain things like resource development that impact climate change?
That's a wonderful question, Mahayo, and thank you for laying out the framework so well and so clearly. I started to work on climate change issues in my own work as an Indigenous legal scholar in 2005. And I have to say that it was started because I went to a conference in the Pacific Northwest, and there were many tribal leaders from Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. And they actually were the first to show those slides of what was happening, that their villages in Alaska were being submerged, that the fish were dying in the Pacific Northwest because the waters had become so hot, and because the way that their migrations worked from the ocean through the rivers were blocked by many of the challenges that you just described in service of hydroelectric power and other forms of energy development in their area that were contaminating the water. And one of them was the Hanford nuclear disposal plant, which actually contaminated the fish resource for the tribes that were affiliated to that area. So that was an eye-opener from me, being from the Southwest, where, as you point out, the main economic development for much of my career in the Four Corners area was coal, but also the revenues that were generated, right, from the dispersal of power throughout the Southwest. The Four Corners area at that time had the biggest concentration of coal-fired power plants in the entire country. There was no other place that was so heavily impacted. When you looked at what the quality of the air was that tribal members living on those lands were experiencing with all of those power plants fired up 100%, it was unbelievable. When you looked at the waste that was generated from those power plants, and the thought was to just submerge it into the earth, all that toxic sludge, just submerge it into the earth. So I started to look at that picture and I thought, well, I'm in a really strange position here, because the political sovereignty of the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe at that particular point in time was, we need the revenues from this development for our members. We don't want outside environmentalists telling us what to do. This is a sovereign decision of the nations, and I was committed to uphold the legal and political sovereignty of every federally recognized tribe in this country. But at the same time, I thought, but what you just said, Mahayo, is true, that there was no teaching in the original laws that were given to Indigenous peoples at their creation. There was no teaching that said that you could alter the earth at that level forever and all time for $1 profit. There was nothing like that. You will not find one Indigenous people on the entire planet that had that as an original teaching. So where did that belief come from, right? And so looking at the US market economy in a global context, it's moving energy for the highest value to the most lucrative market that you can. If the lucrative market is somewhere else, you're going to move that energy somewhere else. So the power plants at the Four Corners served Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles. Those mega cities never would have existed without that energy. So it's a product of economics. Now, I want to be very careful that I'm not blaming any tribal government. I have a great deal of respect for all of the activities that they must engage daily. But I think that both you and I realize that the fossil fuel industry was already designated a dinosaur long before there was any talk of shutting down the power plants at the Four Corners. Those companies knew what was on the horizon. And I actually talked to officials from those companies when I looked at the insurance information and the liability. They wanted out of that business. And that turned into tribal economic self-determination by operating those coal enterprises. So what do we call that in American history? We call it colonialism, right? That's what we call it. It's just a different modern form of it, but it's using tribal nations as resource colonies. Now, everybody, I think, but I don't know, you have to tell me, everybody today recognizes that there is a scientifically documented consensus among all global countries that climate change is occurring more rapidly than we ever would have thought 20 years ago, that the emissions levels are far beyond what is sustainable for our planet, and that if we continue at this scale in the near future, we're going to have more of what's happening right now, those huge hurricanes, those enormous storms. I was just at a conference on tribal water law, and somebody reported back from Alaska about the damage in this latest storm, that the villages were heavily hit. Those were the ones that they're losing their land. There's going to be no land. You mentioned the Colorado River. Everybody sees what is happening. The levels in those reservoirs are down to 25% of what they were. There is no water in the ways that we have gotten accustomed to. What are we going to do about that? Now, I want to hit the pause button there because I want to go on at length. You asked some other very important questions about morality and how we ought to think about this in a different framework, but I want to give you the opportunity to get more into what you think your listeners want to hear.
Oh, wow. That was a great response. And I think that just in what you had said, yes, we can see that a lot of this resource extraction is driven by economics. It is, like you had said, a product of economics. As we look at the fossil fuel industry, you did say the fossil fuel industry was designated a dinosaur long before they shut down power plants. And that seems to be, that is definitely the case, but I think, our tribes kind of get locked into these situations where we depend on some of that money to fund our general funds to push our tribes forward. And a lot of us are not thinking outside of the box to look at, what are some more renewable energy resources or endeavors that we might be able to kind of go in those directions to lessen these types of impacts that we have. I mean, the way that the coal industry has impacted us now, are those impacts reversible right now? I mean, we're seeing that, our temperatures are steadily kind of increasing every year. And so, I think that as we look at those things as well, the other thing I wanted to kind of touch up on that you said was, these are forms of colonialism. The way that we look at how these kinds of situations impact our tribal communities are just so unjust. It does seem that when these kinds of environmental impacts are happening or taking place or being set up throughout Indigenous communities, tribal communities are kind of are impacted at a far greater rate than wealthy communities or communities that are outside of tribal boundaries. I think that the way that we kind of might have seen what had happened with Standing Rock, and the pipeline that our tribal nations fought against, that was being proposed to be put up through there, and even how some of that that pipeline might still be kind of progressing, but it's like those kinds of actions take place in our communities at far higher rates than they do in metropolitan wealthy areas. And if we look at that, then we can see that those are forms of colonialism that still exist and are consistently being impacted on tribal communities. So I think that, yes, I'd like to be able to kind of connect some of the morality issues that we had kind of discussed previously to that, but on that note, how is it that you see that tribal nations are kind of victimized by this resource extraction, and what are some of the things that our people are doing or can do to kind of to mitigate these kinds of impacts?
Thank you so much. So I'm going to approach that question on two levels, because you mentioned this idea of victimization. And in fact, that's heavily embedded in international climate policy. The idea that if there are these vulnerable peoples and communities, that the other nations ought to provide some sort of aid or assistance to them. And so you see that with these massive climate events that basically shut down the electricity, they contaminate the water, the people have nothing, right? There's Puerto Rico was an example of that kind of devastating weather event. So the notion in international human rights law is countries, you ought to care about these vulnerable people and give them aid and assistance. Now, that isn't a really great policy for the future, right? Because it makes the vulnerable community dependent on the beneficent actions of the nation states. They don't have to do that. For a climate refugee, which is all those countries maybe in the South Pacific Islands that are submerging, right? They may not have a country in the Marshall Islands. There may be never again a Marshall Islands. Where is that country going to go? Somebody going to let them in as immigrants? Are they going to be a country, a nation? Is somebody going to move them to some other country? International policy doesn't have that worked out, and yet this is happening right here. So in the United States, we see some version of that. Is FEMA able to assist a tribal community that experiences severe floodings? If there's a catastrophic wildfire, as happened in California to many of those indigenous nations, the wildfire blew through their land, right? The forest gone, the people's homes gone. Who's going to rebuild them? And we are treating US climate policy, or we have historically treated that much the way the international community does. It's a form of government aid when something goes bad, like the pandemic, right? Created all these problems. Let's have a COVID relief bill. Let's do this and that and the other. But you can see that the vulnerable communities depended on these other people with more resources, whether it was governments or whether it was private foundations and wonderful, loving human beings to give that aid to those that were destitute. That again is a beautiful thing that they did. I thank them for doing that, but it is not a sustainable policy to survive as nations into the future. So the other part of that was, well, what can Indigenous peoples do that would reverse that ethic and put them in the decision-making authority, put them in the position of power? What can they do, and is it possible? And I'm here to say that I personally believe it is not only possible, I think it is the best way to go. And I'll tell you why I personally believe this, and there would be other people maybe who argue about this, but this is why I believe this. I believe that the mere fact that we have indigenous peoples in this country and in other countries that are still living on their ancestral territories, that they have that knowledge, that they have survived the most awful level of disease and warfare and starvation and all of these policies historically, they survived that. They're still where they were. They still have that knowledge. And that knowledge is the knowledge of survival. That is resilience at a level that I don't think any other people on the planet have. And when the UN did the 2019 climate assessment, it was the only one internationally that looked at the health of the land and waters. Usually they measure the atmosphere, right? They see what the emissions are and how much we have to go. But that one was a land-based and water-based study. And what it showed is that on the 25% of the Earth's land that essentially were still occupied by indigenous peoples, 80% of the global biodiversity was on that land. And that is also the case domestically in the United States. Tribal governments maintain control over 56 million acres of trust land. Some of it obviously has been developed in the ways that we discussed earlier. Other parts are not. There are nations managing their forest lands. There are nations managing wildlife, fish, doing things which we now associate with climate adaptation planning, but it is with that lens of we belong to this land, we are going to take care of this land, we know this resource, quote unquote, it is our relative, and we are going to treat our relatives accordingly. And I've never seen that ethic built into any other climate adaptation planning. That is a beautiful construct. And the last thing I'll say is the international human rights law does recognize the spiritual rights of indigenous peoples. That is Article 25 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The article says nation states must recognize the intergenerational relationship that indigenous peoples have in place with their ancestral lands, territories, and waters, and their obligations to future generations with respect to that. And there is not another provision in international human rights law like that. It is unique because indigenous peoples have that relationship.
Wow. Wow. Awesome. Awesome. And I think that some of the things you brought up just now, are concepts and ideas that we can segue into this next question. But as indigenous people, we do have a responsibility to future generations, and that's just how we're brought up. We're brought up to think about the generations ahead of us and how we're able to sustain our lands and our water and our air for future generations. And those are things that aren't dependent on any kinds of profit margins. But as we kind of look at how this, our scenario is in places like the United States now, I mean, even water is turning into a commodity that might be started, that can be traded. I mean, these are things that are just, crazy for us to conceptualize. However, maybe you can talk about how we're able to connect the moral argument for indigenous sustainability and the concept of spiritual rights as they pertain to climate change and adaptation plans. I think you hit on some of those things just now, but if you were able to elaborate on some of that would be awesome.
Thank you, Mayo. So I think the challenge for all of the federally recognized tribes in the United States right now is to actually demand that the forms of governance regionally are transformed to put them in the beginning part of decision making, whether it is state or federal. with respect to the lands. And so I believe that the sort of challenge of climate change, again, is that we don't locate the responsibility with any one government or corporation or anything, right? That West Virginia versus EPA case out of the Supreme Court says the EPA can't even take action to curtail greenhouse gases. That's not an authority they have. You bring a human rights lawsuit to make the United States do greenhouse gas emissions controls, it gets thrown out. You can't make a country do any of that stuff. So what is happening is that climate mitigation or adaptation must be a product of the local region. And if you look at the health of the land, the region could straddle international boundaries, it could straddle state boundaries. It's definitely going to intersect with various tribal reservations, right? So just the claim of political and legal sovereignty is a claim to decision-making authority, but it must be exercised in a governance regime that is multiple sovereigns, because no one of them can do the job. They have to work together on it. What is happening on the Colorado River right now is very interesting, because in that shortage, it involves 7 states, it involves a treaty with Mexico, and it involves 30 tribes. And none of the tribes was a party to that 1922 compact that they attribute the quote unquote law of the river to. None of them. They were represented by the federal government at that time. And that is not the current day situation. Tribal nations have, the estimate is almost 50% of the CAP water is tribal water. It's owned. We may not like the framing of ownership of water. There are countries that think the United States is crazy to have this system where you own water, because water is fundamental to the survival of human beings, right? How can you own something like that? But that is the system that we have. And if we look at that, if we're saying 50% of the water in Arizona is actually tribal water, why aren't they driving the policy on that? And I see them now working at that level of ethic together. And that is a good thing. And the other thing it does is possibly prevent the type of thing that happened with energy resource exploitation, because that pit the tribes against each other. And we can see that in the Four Corners area, and allowed a coal company to take however many billions of gallons of pure, pristine aquifer water to slurry that coal to Nevada. That is what happened as a result of the nations being split and not looking at the long term of that in the way that the original indigenous law would probably tell both peoples to do that, right?
Wow, that's intense. And as we look at those things, as we look at the framing of the ownership of water, and how 40 to 50% of the water in Arizona is tribal water. It does seem that it does kind of pit us against each other, for tribes for the government, the US government, to kind of pit tribes against each other to battle for, how our claims to water. Some of these things are not indigenous to our thought and our paradigm, in terms of how we see the land. And sometimes, when people say those things, it seems cliche, but as we look at how the government wants us to quantify our usage, so that we're able to claim these things, it just becomes something that we have to consider in terms of how we're using this water, and it does seem like in a lot of ways, our tribal communities have become less dependent on indigenous kinds of our traditional lifestyles of like farming, and how they were more not dependent, but just how those types of those types of lifestyles were a little bit more dependent on water, how we used water. And nowadays it just seems like you know, all of this water that's running through our lands, it does go to places like, Phoenix, and the power that we create, that we have created through our resource extractive industries like coal went to other places. It didn't benefit our tribes, and but we're left with the impacts of these industries. Also, I think that as we look at how we're able to sustain our cultures, as we look at plant life and animal life and the things that we have here within our communities, we start to see how those are impacted as well by climate change and a lot of these extractive industries. But sometimes, it seems as though, our tribal nations are still in certain ways at the mercy of legislative issues. Um, how are we going to consistently generate these revenues to push our tribes forward? And I think that in those ways, as we kind of depend on extractive industry, we're always keeping ourselves at the mercy of these impacts. We talked about how, we look at generations ahead, and some of our tribes, don't have adaptation plans that address climate change. Um, so, for tribes, maybe you might be able to make an example of some tribes that have done this successfully, or maybe you might be able to offer some best practices for tribes as they move towards, implementing or formulating adaptation plans that address climate change.
Thank you. That's a great question. The great thing about tribal sovereignty is that every Indigenous nation can have its own plan and put whatever it wants to in its own plan and apply that to its own territory up to the jurisdictional boundaries of that. And beyond that, they have to work cooperatively with states and other tribal governments through memorandums of understanding and agreement, as well as with the Bureau of Reclamation or other federal agencies that might control the water. So an adaptation plan has those three dimensions to it, because you have to be able to work with other governments. Some of the most effective ones that I have seen personally were the ones that were developed in the Pacific Northwest. And I mentioned the conference that I went to in 2005, and I kept in touch with those nations as the climate impacts got worse and as they started to exercise a leadership position. And I think what enabled them to be very powerful, and their adaptation plans are amazing. They hired scientists, they hired people to help them with that. They went the whole 9 yards, but they were already accustomed to working with each other because the fish are a collective. I hate to use the word resource because they actually do describe them as their relative and their first food. So there is a sacred value to them. But in the Washington case that quantified the off-reservation fishing rights in those Stevens treaties, the court basically allocated 50% of the fish resource to the tribes collectively, because they all, of course, depended on the fish, the salmon, and then 50% went to the state. And when it came to their adaptation planning, they were in sync that that was their treaty-based right and their relative, and they needed to work as they had in terms of the resource, in terms of protecting that resource from the impacts of climate. So the Washington culverts case, I don't know if any of your listeners have followed that, but that's kind of the modern day view of what happened to the fish resource, and see the state of Washington had all these culverts which were designed to mitigate flooding and do whatever. So they meant well, but the effect of that was to actually kill the fish because they were trying to migrate upstream and they would die. So the tribes brought this lawsuit and said, look, our treaty right is also a right to preserve the fish. And we need an affirmative order that the state has to take those culverts down or repair them in a way that doesn't jeopardize the fish. And they got that order. It was very historic because it's the federal government making the state do something to preserve a treaty protected resource, but they got that. So that is the strength of unified action and adaptation planning to preserve into the future.
Wow, wow. That's really that's like I said, that's really intense. It's there are ways that we need to kind of organize ourselves to legally protect our lands. Are there would you say, are there any um legal twists or legal perspectives or best ways that we might be able to approach, we as tribal nations, to strengthen our approach in in protecting our environments through these types of adaptation plans?
So I think maybe we can go through stages, right? Because change is hard for human beings. They get used to something and they get used to doing it over time, and then they really don't know if they want to change that. So the standard mantra is tribal sovereignty gives you jurisdiction over your land and your people. And then you hope for the best with respect to everything else, but that's all you can really control. And see, the federal government has the trust responsibility, so they have the dollars. And they usually design the policy. Like right now, I cannot even tell you how many billions of dollars have come out in the reconciliation bill and the infrastructure bill. And there's money for the Bureau of Reclamation and USDA and IHS and BIA. Like there's so much money, right? Can it be made available to the tribal nations in a format that allows them to do the type of progressive planning that states have been doing at least since 1920 in the Western states? They all get together, they all look at what they have to do, they all agree on what's going to help them out. If they don't like the federal plan, they lobby Congress to do something different. That's how the states work together. That's how they're working together right now on adaptation planning. The states are in sync. Tribal nations are not encouraged to be in sync with each other. They're encouraged to have their relationship with the federal government and to do things that maybe make sense for them, but it may not make sense for other people. So that's the model that we're in, and I'm happy to address it. It works well for some tribes. It doesn't work well for other tribes. It just depends on who you know in Congress and what can get done for you. But in other countries, it's so different. Like in New Zealand, all of the tribes in New Zealand were parties to the Treaty of Waitangi. So they have one treaty in all of these tribes. And there's a Maori language version of the treaty, and there's an English language version of the treaty. And not surprisingly, they don't always line up. So they have created a tribunal, and they take language snippets out of the treaty in Maori, and they decide what they need. And then they go into the tribunal and they look at the English language version, and then legislation can ensue based on that. So when it came to protecting their river, which is the equivalent scale to the Colorado River, it is a major river. When it came time to protect that, they looked at the treaty, they took a phrase, I'm not going to even attempt to translate it into Maori, but what they said is, for them, the river was their relative and it had a name and it had a personality, and all of this polluting and taking water from it that the non-Maori people were doing was killing their river. And so they actually got legislation recognizing the river as a person. And the legislature appointed guardians for the river. And the guardians weren't supposed to argue that the Maoris owned more, the non-Indian people owned less, none of that. The guardians said, what does the river need to live? And everybody had to be in sync with what the river needed to live. They got a similar thing for a national park kind of mountain area, but the translation was all about the values that were attributed to that person. And it was a different process, but it turned out very well for them. And I guess that would be the out of the box thinking, right? Like, could we craft that kind of a relationship, since tribal nations here own 50% of the water? Can we craft that ethic to say, well, what does the river need to live?
Wow, that's so interesting. I mean, just for the, that example that you made of the Maori people and how they were able to have their, their waterway recognized as a relative, as kind of a living being is something that I think translates to many indigenous people, and for us, as Navajo up here, and for many of our southern tribes as well, or tribes within the state, that's how we kind of look at all of the natural elements of our land. And so that does seem to be a very dynamic and unique, out of the box thought process in terms of maybe how we should move forward to protect our relatives. Relatives not necessarily having to be our human relatives, but the elements that we need to subsist and sustain us as we move forward. That's really a great thought, and that's something that I think that our tribes could all take into account as we move forward. Just a real quick question, and this is just something I'm just kind of thinking about, but you talked about how, or we talked about how, when we look at claims to water, and we start to pit ourselves against each other or any other kinds of resources, does it make sense for tribes to organize regionally? Because it does seem like in many ways there is a divisiveness, maybe even in terms of that might kind of derive from culture or tradition in terms of how tribes related to each other. But now in this day and age where we're at, does it seem like it makes sense for tribes to organize regionally within their areas, to maybe formulate legislation to protect things like the land and the water and some of these other kinds of aspects of impacts, things that would impact our climate change?
Yes, I completely think that it is what tribal nations need to do at this juncture if they want to change the game. Now, you could say we don't want to change the game, and divide and conquer has always been a great strategy for European and European derived countries. They love divide and conquer. You can see that happening in Asia and Africa, all over the place. They love it. It works every single time. But you could say, no, we actually are always going to lose because our river is going to die. Our species, that 2019 report I talked about said 1 million species are on the verge of extinction as of 2019. And 40% of those are predicted to totally disappear in the near future, meaning 5 to 10 years. Like none of those are going to be around. Now, if you really thought that your job was to uphold those living entities that cannot protect themselves, like, you would say, no, we all have to come together. And we have to protect the water, we have to protect the animals and ourselves in the process, but collectively in a way that makes sense. And if you actually did that regionally, This is our watershed. This is our mountain. These are our species. If you did that regionally, you are too powerful to challenge. And that's what happened in the Pacific Northwest, right? Because they're not going to have any salmon if they do business as usual. They're not going to have any. And that is sacred. So if you believe in a concept of the sacred and you believe you have a responsibility, then that is that choice that has to be made. At the conference I was just at, there was a tribal leader from New Mexico that said that the governor had just created something in terms of their water structure because they have many Pueblo Indian nations along that river and that have, again, profound water rights in New Mexico. And the governor convened a different governance structure at which all those nations are represented and they can give their traditional instruction about the water. So it is available as a way to think about that. The Biden administration issued a 2021 order calling that traditional ecological knowledge. In that order, it says it is of equal value to scientific knowledge and agencies must be able to consider it. So they're holding listening sessions right now about how the agencies should work with tribal nations around that. But the tribal nations have to be willing to have that leadership, right? And say, this is what it means to us. This is the terms that we want to engage on. And this is why it's going to benefit everybody.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. I really do appreciate all of the insight you were able to shed on these issues that we wanted to talk about today. Some of the things that that I take away from what you're saying is that we really do need to act on our sovereignty as tribal nations. There's an inherent power and responsibility that goes both ways between tribes and the federal government right now that we have to adhere to in terms of I don't want to people who have been on the land for generations and how we look at the land and we say, we've been here and, these are the things that we know that we need to subsist on our land and how we might even be able to be resources to further environmental protection as we move forward. I think that a lot of tribal nations, we have that expertise inherently in our teachings, and in a lot of ways, maybe science is just catching up to some of the ways that we have been able to look at our lands and protect them and subsist off of them, for generations. So, as tribal people, we really do need to look at our sovereignty. We need to look at, our tribal wisdom and just build on it. And I thought that, maybe in some certain way, those were some of the things that I pulled from what you're saying. I think that there is a lot of dynamic ways that we need to be more strategic politically as we look towards the future and how we're able to protect our relatives. I like what you had said about the Maori. I mean, that's how we look at our rivers. That's how we look at the air, the canyon behind me here. There's so many things that that it seems like don't translate to maybe non-native legislators that we as tribal people know hold true to how we're able to kind of protect ourselves and subsist off of our lands. But just I just want to give you a little bit of time. Maybe there might have been some things I didn't touch on, but did you have any final thoughts on anything that we had talked about thus far before we close out?
That was so beautifully stated, Mahayo, that I don't want to in any way take away from the message that you just gave to your listeners, which is so powerful. And the only thing I will add is that sometimes people that I encounter, they undervalue their own personal power. Maybe they're a native language speaker, maybe they don't have a degree, maybe they're worried that maybe what they say won't be taken well by other people. And I always tell them, your knowledge in language is so profoundly valuable. You understand things at a different level, and that is what we need to accomplish transformative change. You can't change things with the same level of knowledge that created the problem. And that is the problem of climate change, right? That there was a level of knowledge that was creating this problem that Indigenous peoples weren't part of that. So we can redirect things, but we need the participation of all communities, all levels of knowledge of Indigenous people. So the elders, the community members, the people that work on the land, the scientists in Alaska told me that they hadn't even realized that some species were living there. They had mistaken one species for the same thing, and the native people knew that it was a different species. They had them all categorized, and the scientists said they were right. So you're absolutely right with what you just said. The Western science is just catching up to Indigenous knowledge about the environment. That is so powerful. And the young people, the people that I work with, the students, I love them because they are not thinking in those limited ways. They want to break through that, and they have all these complicated social mechanisms. I'm not on social media or any of those things, but I love that they are, and they connect with each other and they form views. And it is very powerful to see what our Indigenous youth, Native youth are doing both in this country and in other countries. So thank you so much for inviting me. Your show is very powerful, and I appreciate this very much.
Thank you, Professor Tsosie, and let's keep in contact. There were a lot of good things that we had talked about today, and maybe sometime down the line we might be able to follow up on them. But just for our viewers, please, if you're tuning in at the last minute here, feel free to rewatch this episode on Facebook, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. Everybody, please keep safe out there. We do have a number of cases of COVID that, we're on the decline, but we're still seeing some of these things. And in a lot of our communities, we're told, we don't have to mask up anymore. If you feel comfortable wearing a mask, wear a mask, wash your hands, watch out for, any of these other viruses like monkeypox. We've had two confirmed cases, maybe one other case that we might have here on the Navajo Nation. But, as our Navajo people had, and tribal communities across the nation had entered into some of the pandemic living, we were very careful and we maintained a cautious lifestyle so that we could protect ourselves and our future generations. So I'm just reiterating, protect yourself out there, stay safe. And until we meet again, which will be next Wednesday, you guys all have a great day. So thank you, Professor Tsosie.
Thank you.